Hello everyone, Professor Helmling here. Welcome again to English 1302. So this video is just going to be me talking through this PowerPoint with tips on note-taking for both the literature we're going to read, but also the sample essays, the student essays that are model text for you when writing your own paper or papers. So we'll just dive into this and talk about, okay, how should we go about taking notes? What kind of things should you pay attention to? And the Norton Introduction to Literature does have an example for you. They've got a little bit of flash fiction called 2020. This is on page, on page 19 of this is the shorter edition. If you have one of the other editions, then the page number might be different, but it should be right there at the beginning. And they have a list of questions to ask yourself when reading fiction. And it's on page 21 where then they apply those questions to this piece of flash fiction called 2020. So I really recommend looking through that carefully and looking at the kind of things that they are keying into in that short example of fiction. Because they're all good strategies for you to use in identifying key points for your own notes. There are, though, a few things that I would like to add to those guiding questions, those basic tips that the editors of the Norton Introduction give you. And these are the other things that I think you should be watching out for when you're reading literature, when you're taking notes on the literature you're reading. One thing that seems pretty obvious is language. You want to really pay attention to the author's language choices, their diction, their syntax, and especially how the diction influences the tone. I always think that's a really good kind of first analytical step for you to use while reading, and it's good to take note of, is to think about, okay, what language are they choosing here, and how is that influencing the feeling that I'm getting while reading this piece? So I think that's a really good first analytical step, and a great thing to put into your notes as well. Now, beyond that, the next thing I would recommend is looking out for these literary devices that if you go back to your high school English classes, you think about the things that your English teachers were always pointing out to you. Figurative language moves like metaphor, simile, personification. Other important things like symbolism, sound devices like onomatopoeia, and other structural moves. And this can overlap with language. You can have things like parallel structure in the language, but it's being used for a particular literary effect. So all of those are good things to pay attention to too. And when you see them, it's one thing to take note of them and say, "Oh, there's a metaphor," but then you can also flag in your notes like, "Okay, metaphor." And me, when I do this kind of thing, I just use a shorthand. I'll put metaphor equals and then maybe a key word as to why I think this author is using that particular metaphor. What bigger idea does it help them get to? Because when we talk about these literary devices, just identifying them isn't enough. You want to really have a sense of why they're being used, what effect they're creating, and that helps you down the road when you're analyzing. The next area here that I would pay attention to is the structure of the piece, choices the author is making in terms of how they organize it. Now, when you're reading poetry, this can be about particular forms in poetry. The way that the stanzas are structured, the particular rhyme scheme. Does it fit a particular format like the villanelle or the sonnet, things like that. So those are some real obvious structural choices in poetry that you can look at. In fiction, it's a little bit different. You can look at, okay, is the story set up in sections? Is the progression of ideas, progression of the story chronological, or does it move around? Things like that. And, another thing, speaking of fiction, this is especially important for fiction, is, you want to pay attention to the point of view. Who is telling the story? Or in the case of poetry, who is the speaker? Sometimes we have a narrator telling us a story who is outside of the action of the story, a third-person narrator. Sometimes we have a first-person narrator who's part of the story, or maybe a first-person observer. They're still a character, but not central to the action, different things like that in fiction. And in poetry, who is the speaker? Sometimes there's a really clearly defined sense of a character in a speaker, and sometimes not. But thinking about the speaker's point of view in the poem is always a useful way to analyze it. So those are some things to think about as well. And really all of these different things that you want to be paying attention to, the kind of questions that the field guide, the introduction to literature editors tell us to pay attention to, and all of these things I'm telling you to pay attention to, it's all to better understand the theme. What is the author's intention? What are we meant to think about after we read this particular work of literature? Because I think that's what really elevates any work, any text above just being, entertainment or informational. If it's literature, the kind of canonical literature that we want to study in a class like this, then it's going to make you think. It's going to have things to think about. And so all of these other choices that the author is making, you always want to connect them back to theme and to the big question of, okay, what is this work trying to say to us? So those are all things to pay attention to when we're analyzing works of literature. And so put those things in your notes. When you see that, make little notes to yourself. Whatever system you're using for your notes, if you're marking in a book or you're marking in an online book with the little comment features, or you're just jotting things down in a notebook, whatever system you're using, these are the kind of things you want to pay attention to. Now, one thing I like to broach with students is the fact that some of the texts that we read can be very challenging for students. I always stress to students when I'm working face-to-face in-person classes at many points during my interactions, I always stress, the more you read, the better. The more that you read complex, challenging literature like this, the better you get at decoding more of it. As a classic example, there's Shakespeare. A lot of people have difficulty with Shakespeare, and it's completely understandable. Shakespeare is speaking in a dialect that is 400 years old. And so it can be daunting. Some of the diction is different, some of the syntax patterns are different, and it is just difficult sometimes to decode. So with any literature that does feel especially challenging like that, the long-term solution is just keep reading more. The more you read, the better you'll get at it. But here we are, we're in a semester. Let's say you're coming in at this level, and this is the reading level you're comfortable with, and some of these texts are going to be challenging. So what do? Now, obviously, we live in the information age, and there's lots of resources available. When I was in high school and college, if you wanted Cliff Notes, you had to actually go to a store and buy them. Now, of course, these helpers are available with a click of a mouse button. They're everywhere, like Spark Notes, or even just reading the Wikipedia articles can sometimes help. And notice I'm saying help. Now, what it should never do using one of these resources, it should never take the place of reading a text. There's a right way to use something like Spark Notes. So, let's say you start reading a text, you get a paragraph and you're like, wow, this is dense, I'm not following this. This is gonna be terrible. Well, what you can do is you can lean on one of these references, and you can go and read the summary in Spark Notes, or even read the analysis in Spark Notes, or read the summary in Wikipedia. And that gives you a framework to better understand as you're reading. So then you go back to the actual text. You don't want to use one of these things as a crutch. You want to use it as a support. So don't try to replace your readings and shortcut it. That's not helping you develop as a reader. You want to use this experience in this course to develop as a reader, as an analytical reader, as a deep reader of literature. And so just relying on these summaries in place of the reading, that's not going to do that. That's not going to help you grow in that way. But what they can do is they can give you a little boost. They can help you so that you can make more of the text on your own. So that's the right way to use these things. Now, the other thing to remember is that when we're doing scholarly research, when we get to the research paper, general sources with commonly held, superficial, basic analysis of a literary text like SparkNotes, like Wikipedia, they're not the kind of in-depth sources we want to use in our research. They're too basic, too straightforward. If we're working at that level, then we're not really doing good scholarship. We're not doing good analysis ourselves. So while they might help you understand a text the first time you read it, when you are digging into your own analysis and analyzing a work for your big paper, for example, in 1302, or for any literature class, you should never, ever, ever have something like SparkNotes or Wikipedia in your bibliography. You should not be referencing them in your paper. If you're getting ideas out of SparkNotes and Wikipedia for your paper, you're not working at a very deep level. You're just working at too basic a level. And so you want to be careful about that as well. And we've got access through EPCC to a lot of databases that specialize in literature. I like the Gale literature databases, but there's others. EBSCO has some. We have JSTOR. There's a lot of more in-depth scholarly articles that we can draw from and that you can synthesize into your paper, into your thinking, to help you go deeper. So keep that in mind about those sort of supports. Now, all that's about the literature that we're going to read, and that's most of what we read in English 1302. But we do read a couple of sample student essays as exemplars for us to learn from. And so when we're reading those, we're reading them for very different purposes. When we're reading a poem, we're reading a story, we're reading a part of a play, we're reading those to deepen our understanding of literature and to analyze them, to practice our analytical skills. But when we're reading these sample essays, someone's already gone to a work of literature and done that analysis. And so we're looking at how did they do that? And we want to learn from their examples. So it's a little bit different what we want to do with those sorts of essays. And when you're taking note on those, you want to pay attention to their moves as a writer. You want to pay attention to their focus or their thesis. What was their main idea when they were analyzing the work of literature they're analyzing? You want to look at how did they use evidence, both from the text they're analyzing itself, but also from sources, from outside sources, like what we were just talking about with the database sources. How are they synthesizing ideas from these other sources into their writing? How do they organize their paper? One good way to do that is to, create for yourself a brief outline of their main points. What are their big ideas and how do they choose to what did they decide? I'm going to talk about this first and then this and then this. So thinking about how they made those decisions can help us make those decisions for ourselves in our own writing. And finally, you also want to pay attention to their use of language, their language and syntax, and how they put those ideas together at the sentence level. One thing I always ask people to do in reading essays, model essays like this, is to flag sentences where you're like, ooh, that's a good line. They really put those ideas together well there. That's a syntax move I would like to be able to make in my writing, something like that. Because I have a little exercises that I like to do with that kind of thing. So that's a good thing to take note of also. So that's when you're reading a model essay, like a sample student essay where they're writing about literature and we can learn from their examples. Okay? Now, there are other things in our Norton textbook that can help you with this journey and can help you take better notes as well. I don't assign like the section on poetry from the book or the section on fiction from the book, but there's a lot of background information like that as well. And so if you ever feel that you need more explanation of elements of fiction or you need more explanation of dramatic traditions, things like that, then there's lots in the Norton introduction. And that material can also be useful to you down the road when you're writing your paper. So just be aware that there's a lot more in the book than what's assigned on the syllabus. And of course, the last thing on this slide here is if you ever have any questions about, how to work with any text or what a particular text is doing, that's what the forums are for. Feel free always to post those questions or just shoot me a message because, you want to be sure that you aren't just leaving those things unsaid where it's like, oh, I don't understand this. oh well. You always want to ask questions. That's what scholarship is. It's a process of questioning everything. And so if you have questions, don't be shy about asking them. So that's just a quick run through of what we can be thinking about and writing down as notes when we're looking at both literature and your model essays. All right, so hope that was somewhat helpful, but if not, like I said, always feel free to ask questions.